When Ethan Durant, a young and dedicated postman, rang the doorbell on his familiar route, he never imagined the horror awaiting him on the other side. As the door creaked open, he found himself face to face with a chilling sight. Mrs. Thompson, once the embodiment of suburban grace, now stood before him in a shocking state of neglect. Her once neat silver hair was tangled and oily, her clothing stained and hanging loosely. She was only a shadow of the vibrant woman he remembered. As she swayed unsteadily, Ethan caught a glimpse inside her home, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Piles of clutter, layers of dust, and stale, heavy air filled the room, painting a grim picture of isolation and decline. In that heart-stopping moment, Ethan knew he couldn't just walk away. He had to act. Before we dive into this powerful story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're captivated by this suspenseful tale, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss more stories like this one. The early morning light barely broke through the clouds as Ethan Durant stirred in bed, the loud, jarring sound of his alarm clock pulling him from sleep. Though the pre-dawn hour might be a struggle for some, it was a familiar ritual for Ethan. For years, he had risen at this time, his body attuned to the rhythms of his daily routine. Swinging his legs out of bed, he stretched, feeling the slight chill in the air that seemed to fill his modest apartment each morning. The apartment was small, but it had everything Ethan needed. It was neatly kept, with little clutter beyond a few books by his bedside and his framed postal service certificate on the wall. Ethan took pride in the simple order of his home. It was an extension of the discipline he maintained in his work. He made his way to the bathroom, splashing his face with cold water, the brisk shock chasing away the last remnants of sleep. As he patted his face dry, he caught his reflection in the mirror, and a small, proud smile crept onto his face as he adjusted the collar of his postal uniform. The crisp blue fabric, the neat emblem of the eagle stitched onto his sleeve, it wasn't just a uniform to Ethan. To him, it represented a connection to his town and the people he served. It was a symbol of trust, one that he carried with quiet pride each day. His breakfast was simple, a banana and a granola bar, just enough to fuel him for the start of his rounds. Grabbing his thermos of coffee, he took a deep breath as he stepped outside. The streets of Copper Hill were still cloaked in the quiet hush of early morning, a blanket of calm that Ethan found grounding. He liked these early moments before the town awoke, before the bustle and noise filled the air. The scent of fresh-cut grass and the faint bloom of spring flowers floated on the breeze, and Ethan breathed it in deeply, savoring the tranquility. He arrived at the post office as he did every morning, nodding a hello to a few coworkers as they gathered to begin their own routes. There was a sense of camaraderie here, a silent understanding between them as they prepared for the long day of deliveries ahead. Each of them had a different route, but they all shared the same goal: connecting the people of Copper Hill through letters, packages, and parcels of all shapes and sizes. Sliding into the driver's seat of his postal van, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The van had seen better days, with its worn leather seats and a faint aroma of paper and ink that never seemed to fade. But to him, it was like a second home. Over the years, he'd come to know each crack in the dashboard, each quirk of the engine, and he found a sort of comfort in the familiarity. As he started the engine, the van rumbled to life, and Ethan began his route. Copper Hill slowly stirred around him, early risers emerging to retrieve their morning newspapers, dog walkers greeting him with a friendly nod, and joggers giving him a wave as they passed by. Though these interactions were brief and often wordless, they added meaning to his day. Ethan valued these moments, these fleeting connections with the townspeople he had come to know over time. It was these encounters that reminded him that he was part of something larger, a fabric woven together by the simple yet essential act of delivering the mail. By mid-morning, Ethan found himself pausing to sort through his next stack of letters and packages. Leaning against the side of his van, he absently flipped through the envelopes, his fingers moving with practiced ease. His hands knew the rhythm, the way the paper felt, the small details that marked each parcel. But today, something caught his attention, a familiar name on one of the packages: Mrs. Jane Thompson. Ethan smiled at the thought of Mrs. Thompson. She was one of his favorite people on the route, an elderly woman who lived alone on Elm Street. Each time he delivered to her, she greeted him warmly, often engaging him in brief but genuine conversation. Her kind, crinkled eyes, her laughter, and her gentle curiosity always brightened his day. Mrs. Thompson made him feel seen and appreciated, an antidote to the solitude that could sometimes come with his job. As he drove toward her street, Ethan found himself looking forward to seeing her. But when he pulled up to her house, something felt different. The usually tidy yard seemed slightly neglected, with weeds poking up through the flower beds and grass growing a little too long. It was a small change, but one that stood out to someone like Ethan, who noticed the little details from his daily rounds. Brushing off the feeling, he picked up the package and made his way up the front path. The concrete beneath his feet was warm, soaking up the early sun. But as he approached her door, he saw a pile of newspapers stacked on the porch, edges curling and yellowing. He frowned, noticing the overflowing mailbox. Something was clearly out of place. Pressing the doorbell, he waited, shifting from one foot to the other as he listened for any sound inside. Seconds passed, stretching into a full minute, but there was no answer. Ethan tried again, adding a few light knocks. Still, silence. Mrs. Thompson, normally so quick to answer, was nowhere in sight. Ethan pulled out his notepad, scribbled a quick note about the package, and slipped it into her mailbox. Just as he turned to leave, he noticed movement next door. Mr. Jenkins, her neighbor, was out watering his rose bushes. Ethan raised a hand in greeting, a thought forming in his mind as he approached the fence. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins," he called out. The elderly man looked up, shading his eyes from the sun. "Morning, Ethan. How's it going?" "I'm doing well," Ethan replied, hesitating slightly. "Say, I was just stopping by Mrs. Thompson's, but she didn't answer the door. Have you seen her lately?" Mr. Jenkins frowned, his face creasing with concern. "Now that you mention it, I haven't seen Jane in quite a while. Used to see her out in the garden every day, but—" He trailed off, looking troubled. Ethan's worry deepened. "Do you know how long it's been?" "Oh, probably a couple of weeks, I'd guess. Everything all right?" Ethan forced a small smile, trying not to let his concern show. "I'm sure she's fine. Thanks for your help." But as he walked back to his van, a nagging feeling took root in his mind. Mrs. Thompson's absence, the uncollected mail, and the overgrown yard all added up to something that didn't sit right. Climbing into his van, he took a deep breath, willing himself to focus on the rest of his route. But as he drove away, his thoughts remained anchored to Mrs. Thompson's quiet house, a shadow of worry following him through the rest of his day. Bookmark? As the morning wore on, Ethan continued his route, but the lingering worry over Mrs. Thompson clung to him like a shadow. He tried to brush it off, telling himself there must be a simple explanation. Maybe she was visiting family, or perhaps she wasn't feeling well and was staying indoors to recover. But the sight of her untended yard, the stack of newspapers, and Mr. Jenkins' concern replayed in his mind, casting doubt over every comforting thought he tried to muster. As the clock approached noon, Ethan found himself pulling into the parking lot of Mabel's diner, a cozy little spot he frequented for lunch. The neon sign flickered faintly, even in the daylight, welcoming regulars with the promise of hearty food and friendly faces. Normally, his midday stop here provided a chance to recharge, a familiar comfort amid his daily routine. But today, his mind felt too restless for even a moment's peace. Stepping inside, he was greeted by the familiar jingle of the bell above the door and the warm, comforting aroma of coffee and freshly grilled sandwiches. Mabel herself, a round, cheerful woman with silver-streaked hair and an ever-present smile, waved him over from behind the counter. "Hey there, Ethan," she called out. "The usual?" Ethan nodded, managing a half-smile as he slid onto his usual stool. "Yes, thanks, Mabel." As she prepared his turkey club and fries, Mabel glanced over her shoulder at him, her brows knitting together slightly. "You look troubled, hon. Something on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, unsure if he should voice his concern. But Mabel was someone he trusted, someone who knew the town and its people as well as he did, if not better. Maybe talking it through with her would help ease his mind. "It's about Mrs. Thompson," he began slowly. "You know, the older lady on Elm Street. I stopped by her place this morning, but she didn't answer the door. I noticed her yard looking a bit overgrown, and her mailbox was stuffed with uncollected mail. Even her newspapers are piling up on the porch. Mabel's hands paused mid-motion, and she turned to give him a concerned look. That doesn't sound like Jane at all. She's always been so particular about keeping her place neat. Exactly, Ethan replied, feeling his worry validated by Mabel's reaction. I asked her neighbor, Mr. Brat Jenkins, if he'd seen her recently, but he said it's been a couple of weeks since he last saw her. Mabel shook her head, her expression troubled. Jane's been coming here every Tuesday for as long as I can remember, meeting with the church ladies for lunch. Now that you mention it, I don't think she's been in for a few weeks either. Ethan's heart sank a little. Hearing that Mrs. Thompson hadn't even been showing up for her weekly lunch only deepened his unease. Mabel was right. Mrs. Thompson wasn't the type to neglect her yard, her mail, or her usual routines. This was a woman who thrived on connection, and who seemed to find joy in every interaction, no matter how small. Mabel placed his sandwich and fries in front of him, but for the first time, Ethan barely registered the scent of his favorite meal. He poked at his food, his appetite dimmed by the nagging worry that was steadily growing in the back of his mind. You know, Mabel said gently, her voice breaking through his thoughts, sometimes our instincts tell us things we can't quite explain. If something doesn't feel right, Ethan, maybe you should trust that feeling. You know Jane, and you know she's not the type to just disappear. Ethan looked up, meeting Mabel's concerned gaze. Her words seemed to echo his own thoughts, the ones he'd been trying to push down all morning. Maybe he was overthinking things, but at the same time, every instinct he had was telling him that something was wrong. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You're probably right, Mabel. I don't want to overstep. I'm her mailman, not her family. What if she's just under the weather and doesn't want anyone to fuss over her? Mabel smiled, a soft, understanding look in her eyes. Ethan, sometimes it's the people who aren't family who notice these things. You're more than just her mailman. You're part of her life. And if it turns out to be nothing, then no harm is done. But if something is wrong, and you're the one who steps in to help, well, that might be exactly what she needs. Ethan nodded, letting her words sink in. He knew Mabel was right. Mrs. Thompson had always gone out of her way to show kindness to him, treating him with a respect that went beyond their brief encounters. And while he didn't know the details of her personal life, he knew enough to recognize that she deserved someone to look out for her, even if that someone happened to be her mailman. As he stood up to leave, Mabel gave him a reassuring pat on the arm. You do what feels right, Ethan. I know you've got a good heart. He managed a small, grateful smile. Thanks, Mabel. I'll check in on her again. Back in his van, Ethan sat for a moment, his hand resting on the steering wheel as he tried to steady himself. He knew he was about to make a choice that might take him out of his comfort zone, but something deep within him urged him forward. His gut told him to go back to Mrs. Thompson's house, to see if she would answer this time. Starting the engine, Ethan turned his van back onto Elm Street, the familiar route now heavy with a sense of urgency. As he approached her house, the unease he had felt that morning was even stronger now, sharpened by Mabel's shared concern. He parked at the curb, taking a deep breath before stepping out and heading up the front path. As he neared the porch, the air felt still, unnaturally quiet. He pressed the doorbell and waited, straining to catch any sound of movement inside. Seconds ticked by, stretching into an uncomfortable silence. Ethan knocked firmly, calling out, "Mrs. Thompson? It's Ethan, your mailman. Just wanted to make sure you're okay." But there was no response, only the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant hum of a lawnmower from a neighboring yard. He took a step back, casting a worried glance over the unkempt yard, the stack of newspapers, and the overflowing mailbox. The little details that had seemed minor at first now stood out like flashing warning signs. Feeling a growing sense of dread, Ethan weighed his options. Should he leave and hope she'd show up at Mabel's next week, or keep trying to make sure she was safe? His gut told him he couldn't walk away this time. If he left and something terrible happened, he would never forgive himself. Finally, he made up his mind. He would return to his van, wait for a bit longer, and consider calling for help if he still hadn't seen her. Mrs. Thompson was someone he respected, someone he felt a sense of duty to, and if something was indeed wrong, He was determined to find a way to help. Ethan sat in his postal van, watching Mrs. Thompson's house with a gnawing sense of unease. He waited for any sign of movement, any hint that she was inside, safe and sound. The minutes dragged on, and the house remained silent and still, as if it had absorbed all the life and warmth that had once radiated from Mrs. Thompson herself. After several long minutes, Ethan made up his mind. He wasn't leaving without answers this time. He stepped out of the van and made his way back up the walkway, each step heavy with a determination he hadn't felt before. As he approached the door, a faint, unpleasant smell drifted from the porch area. He hesitated, his heart pounding faster as he tried to place the scent. It was subtle but unsettling, a mix of stale air and something faintly sour. Swallowing his unease, he knocked on the door again, louder this time. "Mrs. Thompson?" he called, his voice carrying an urgency he couldn't hide. "It's Ethan. Are you okay?" This time, after a tense silence, he heard something inside. A slow, shuffling sound, like someone moving with great effort. Relief flooded him, quickly replaced by concern. When the door creaked open, he found himself face to face with a woman who barely resembled the vibrant Mrs. Thompson he knew. Her usually neat silver hair was disheveled and greasy, her face pale and drawn. She looked at him through unfocused, glassy eyes, and Ethan's heart ached to see the woman he admired so frail and disoriented. Even her clothing, a simple house dress, was wrinkled and stained, a far cry from her usual tidy appearance. "Mrs. Thompson," Ethan said softly, fighting to keep the shock out of his voice. "It's me, Ethan, your mailman. Are you all right?" She blinked at him, as though struggling to recognize him. After a moment, a faint spark of recognition flickered in her eyes. "Oh, Ethan," she murmured, her voice weak and raspy. "I'm fine, dear. Just a little under the weather." Her words slurred together slightly, and she swayed on her feet. Ethan instinctively reached out to steady her, but she shrank back, as if wary of being touched. He let his hand drop, his worry deepening as he took in the state of her clothes. There were faint red stains on her dress, and the odor he'd noticed before was stronger now, a mix of unwashed body and something sickly sweet that he couldn't quite identify. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked gently, his voice laced with concern. "You don't look well. Is there someone I can call for you? Maybe a family member or a doctor?" Mrs. Thompson waved a trembling hand, dismissing his offer. No, I'm all right. Just need a bit of rest," she replied, though her words sounded forced, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as him. She shifted on her feet, her eyes flickering toward the inside of the house, as if reluctant to let him see too much. But as she adjusted herself, the door swung open wider, and Ethan caught a glimpse of the room behind her. The sight made his stomach drop. Her once tidy living room was in a state of utter disarray. Trash and empty food containers littered the floor, papers were scattered across the furniture, and there was a layer of dust on everything. The air inside seemed thick and stale, as if the windows hadn't been opened in days. "Mrs. Thompson, please," Ethan said, his voice urgent now. "Let me help you. This doesn't look right. You need someone to check on you." Her gaze hardened slightly, a flicker of the stubbornness he remembered in her. "I said I'm fine," she replied, a sudden edge to her voice. "Thank you for your concern, Ethan, but I can manage on my own." With that, she began to close the door. Ethan stood there, stunned, as the door clicked shut, and he heard the faint sound of the lock engaging. He stayed rooted to the spot, the image of her frail figure and the chaotic state of her home replaying in his mind. Something was terribly wrong, and her dismissal of his concerns only made his worry grow. Slowly, Ethan turned and walked back to his van, each step feeling heavier than the last. Climbing into the driver's seat, he gripped the steering wheel, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. On one hand, she had made it clear that she didn't want his help, that she was fine. She was an adult, capable of making her own choices, and he wasn't family, just her mailman. Did he have the right to interfere? But on the other hand, he couldn't ignore what he had seen. The Mrs. Thompson he knew would never live in such conditions, would never let herself fall into such a state. This was a woman who had always greeted him with warmth, who had taken pride in her home and her appearance. The sight of her in such distress, her home in shambles, and the faint stains on her clothes all painted a picture that haunted him. Ethan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He thought about all the times Mrs. Thompson had shown him kindness, the moments she had brightened his day with her warm smile and thoughtful questions. She was more than just a resident on his route. She was part of his community, someone who had treated him with respect and kindness. Could he really turn his back on her now, knowing something was clearly wrong? His gut told him no. He couldn't walk away, not this time. With a deep breath, he made up his mind. Even if she got angry, even if he was overstepping, he owed it to her to do everything he could to make sure she was safe. Ethan reached for his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he dialed 911. He knew this call could change things, that it might be seen as an intrusion into her private life. But he also knew it was the right thing to do. The dispatcher's voice came through, calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? Swallowing the lump in his throat, Ethan began to speak, his words tumbling out in a rush of concern. My name is Ethan Durant. I'm a mailman, and I'm worried about one of the residents on my route. Her name is Jane Thompson, and she lives at 1247 Elm Street. I've been to her house twice today, and something's very wrong. As he relayed everything he had observed, the unkempt yard, the overflowing mailbox, Mrs. Thompson's disheveled appearance, the disturbing stains on her clothing, and the state of her home, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Relief that he was finally taking action, and apprehension over what might come next. The dispatcher assured him that they would send officers to perform a welfare check right away, given the seriousness of the situation. They would also dispatch an ambulance, as it sounded like Mrs. Thompson might need immediate medical attention. As he ended the call, Ethan sat in the van, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. He had set things in motion, and now there was no turning back. All he could do was wait and hope that he had made the right choice. The minutes felt like hours as Ethan waited in his van, watching the quiet house and trying to keep his mind steady. His decision to call 911 weighed heavily on him, and a part of him wondered if he'd overreacted. But each time he pictured Mrs. Thompson's frail figure and her chaotic home, his worry only deepened. He had done the right thing. He had to believe that. Finally, the wail of sirens pierced the stillness of the neighborhood, growing louder as a police cruiser and an ambulance turned onto Elm Street. Ethan's heart raced as he saw the vehicles pull up in front of Mrs. Thompson's house. He climbed out of his van, his eyes glued to the unfolding scene, a mix of relief and anxiety washing over him. Two police officers exited the cruiser, their faces serious as they approached Ethan. The taller of the two nodded at him, a look of quiet determination in his eyes. Are you the one who called this in? The officer asked, his voice calm but firm. Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, sir. I'm Ethan Durant, the mailman for this route. I'm the one who called about Mrs. Thompson. The officer pulled out a notepad, jotting down Ethan's name and brief details of the situation. Can you tell us exactly what you saw that made you concerned enough to call 911? Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself as he recounted everything. How Mrs. Thompson hadn't collected her mail or newspapers for weeks, her disheveled appearance when she finally answered the door, and the disturbing condition of her house. As he spoke, he saw the officers' expressions grow more serious, their brows furrowing with each detail. You said she spoke to you earlier, but now she's not answering? The second officer asked, a hint of concern in his voice. That's right, Ethan replied, nodding. She answered the door, maybe 20 minutes before I called you. She insisted she was fine, but she clearly wasn't. And now she's not responding at all. The two officers exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. The first officer nodded, then turned toward the house. All right, we're going to check it out. You stay here, he instructed Ethan. Ethan nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat as he watched the officers approach Mrs. Thompson's front door. One of them rang the doorbell while the other positioned himself to the side, one hand resting on his holster as a precaution. Ethan held his breath, his heart pounding as he waited for any sign of movement from inside. Several tense moments passed with no response. The officers knocked loudly, announcing themselves as police and asking Mrs. Thompson to open the door if she could hear them. The silence that followed felt like it stretched on forever. each second amplifying the sense of dread in Ethan's chest. Finally, after several more attempts to get a response, the officers conferred briefly, their expressions grim. Then, to Ethan's shock, they positioned themselves to force entry into the home. "Wait," Ethan called out, unable to stop himself. "Are you sure that's necessary?" The second officer turned to him, his face sympathetic but resolute. "Sir, based on what you've told us and the lack of response, we have reason to believe Mrs. Thompson may be in immediate danger. We need to perform a welfare check, and that means entering the premises if necessary." Ethan nodded, stepping back to give them space. He watched, his stomach twisting, as they forced the door open, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the quiet neighborhood. As the officers disappeared inside, Ethan stood on the curb, his breath shallow, a mix of fear and hope churning inside him. The next few minutes felt like an eternity as he waited, straining to hear any sounds from within the house. Then, suddenly, there was a flurry of movement and raised voices. "We need medical assistance in here now," one of the officers shouted from inside the house. The paramedics, who had been waiting by the ambulance, sprang into action, grabbing medical bags and rushing inside. Ethan felt his heart clench as he watched them disappear into the house, his mind racing with questions about what they had found. The scene felt surreal, like something out of a TV drama, rather than the quiet, familiar street he knew so well. He stood there, rooted to the spot, as more voices joined the commotion inside the house. He could hear urgent instructions being called out, the rustle of equipment, and then, faintly, a pained moan that he recognized as Mrs. Thompson's voice. The sound hit him like a physical blow, his worry now tempered by a sharp pang of guilt. He should have noticed sooner. He should have acted earlier. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, one of the police officers emerged from the house. His face was grim as he approached Ethan, his notepad still in hand. "Mr. Durant," he began, his voice low and serious. "I need to ask you a few more questions about Mrs. Thompson. When was the last time you saw her before today?" Ethan's throat tightened, but he forced himself to answer. "It must have been about 2 weeks ago, maybe a little more. She usually greets me when I deliver the mail, but I haven't seen her in a while." That's partly why I was so worried today." The officer nodded, making notes. "In your interactions with her, did she ever mention any health issues? Or any family members or friends who check on her regularly?" Ethan shook his head, his worry intensifying. "No, she never mentioned any serious health problems. And I don't know much about her personal life. She lives alone, as far as I know." As they spoke, the front door opened again, and this time the paramedics emerged, guiding a stretcher. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw Mrs. Thompson lying on it, looking small and frail beneath the blankets and straps. An IV bag hung from a pole attached to the stretcher, and an oxygen mask covered most of her face. Seeing her like this, so vulnerable, was almost more than he could bear. This was Mrs. Thompson, the woman who had always greeted him with a smile, who had shared small stories about her garden and always asked about his day. Now, she looked like a ghost of herself, her skin pale and her body frighteningly fragile. As the paramedics carefully loaded Mrs. Thompson into the ambulance, Ethan turned to the officer, his voice barely above a whisper. What happened in there?" The officer sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's not good, Mr. Durant. From what we can tell, Mrs. Thompson appears to be a cancer patient. We found medication and medical supplies inside, but she's severely dehydrated and malnourished. It's likely she's been trying to care for herself at home, but she's at a stage where she needs constant medical care." Ethan felt his knees go weak, the reality of her condition sinking in. But she answered the door earlier. She said she was fine." The officer gave him a sympathetic look. People in her condition often try to hide how bad things are. Pride, fear, confusion, there could be many reasons. What's important is that you trusted your instincts and called us. You may very well have saved her life." The words were meant to comfort him, but they only deepened the guilt and sorrow swirling inside Ethan. If he had acted sooner, if he had checked on her earlier, could this have been prevented? As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle prepared to leave, Ethan felt a surge of determination rising within him. He couldn't change the past, but he could be there for Mrs. Thompson now. He turned to the officer, his voice steady and resolute. "Which hospital are they taking her to? I'd like to check on her if that's allowed." The officer's face softened, and he nodded approvingly. "They're taking her to Mercy General. She'll be in good hands there, and I think a familiar face might do her some good." As the ambulance pulled away, Ethan watched until it disappeared around the corner. He had done what he could, but he wasn't finished. For now, his route would have to wait. He had somewhere far more important to be. Bookmark go back. As the ambulance vanished down the street, Ethan stood on the curb, his mind spinning. He'd made the right call, he reassured himself, but the haunting image of Mrs. Thompson lying pale and frail on the stretcher left him feeling shaken. After a few steadying breaths, he climbed into his van, resolving to finish his remaining deliveries quickly so he could make his way to Mercy General Hospital. As he drove, his mind wandered back to every moment he'd shared with Mrs. Thompson. She had always been a constant presence on his route, the kind of person who turned a simple mail delivery into a warm, memorable exchange. He thought of the Christmas card she'd given him last year, a small token of appreciation for his reliable service. She had even tucked a little candy cane inside, just to make him smile. The thought of her now, alone and unwell, made his heart ache. Finally, after rushing through his last few deliveries, he parked outside Mercy General, the imposing hospital building casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Ethan stepped inside, taking in the sterile scent of disinfectant and the low hum of voices and machines. He approached the reception desk, where a nurse with a warm smile looked up at him. "Can I help you?" she asked kindly. "Yes, I'm here to check on a patient," Ethan said, doing his best to keep his voice steady. "Her name is Jane Thompson. She was brought in just a little while ago." The nurse's smile softened, and she nodded. "I'll see if we can get you some information. Are you a family member?" Ethan hesitated, realizing he might not be allowed in. "No, I'm her mailman. I found her at her home today, and I called 911. I just wanted to make sure she's okay." The nurse's eyes held a trace of surprise, but she quickly masked it with a reassuring nod. "Let me check with her attending physician. Wait here for a moment." Ethan watched as she disappeared through a set of double doors, his heart pounding as he waited. The waiting room around him was bustling with people. A few young parents soothing restless children, an elderly couple holding hands, and a man anxiously scrolling through his phone. Everyone here seemed to carry a quiet weight of worry, a reminder of the serious purpose that brought them all to this place. After what felt like an eternity, the nurse returned, a doctor following close behind her. The doctor was a tall woman with a compassionate expression, and she motioned for Ethan to sit with her in a quiet corner of the waiting area. "Mr. Durant?" she asked, glancing at her clipboard. "I understand you're the one who found Mrs. Thompson?" Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, I was on my route when I noticed something was wrong. I just wanted to make sure she's all right." The doctor sighed, a look of sympathy crossing her face. "First, let me assure you, she's receiving the care she needs now. I want you to know that your actions may very well have saved her life, but her condition is serious." Ethan's stomach twisted. How bad is it?" The doctor glanced at her notes, choosing her words carefully. "Mrs. Thompson is suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition. She also has advanced cancer, and from what we can tell, she was attempting to manage her care on her own. We found evidence of recent treatments, but unfortunately, she was too weak to properly care for herself." A wave of guilt washed over Ethan, nearly overwhelming him. He had seen her every week and spoken to her, and yet he had never known she was suffering like this. "I wish I'd noticed sooner," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The doctor gave him a reassuring smile. "It's not your fault, Mr. Durant. Many patients, especially elderly ones, try to hide how bad things are. They often don't want to be a burden or admit they need help. Mrs. Thompson likely didn't want to worry anyone." Ethan looked down, his hands clenching in his lap. He felt an immense sadness, knowing that Mrs. Thompson had gone through such a difficult time alone. Is there anything I can do to help?" The doctor studied him for a moment, then nodded. "For now, she's stable, and we're closely monitoring her. She's sedated, so she won't be able to have visitors just yet, but knowing someone is here for her might mean more than you realize. If you'd like to stay, I can let you know when she's awake." Ethan nodded, grateful for the chance to be close by. "Thank you, Doctor. I'd like that." The doctor gave him a small nod and then left him to wait, promising to return with any updates. Settling into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs in the waiting room, Ethan prepared himself for a long wait. His mind was filled with memories of Mrs. Thompson, of her kind words and gentle humor, her warm smile that had brightened so many of his days. Hours passed, and the steady hum of hospital life continued around him. Ethan watched doctors and nurses rush by, their faces set in expressions of focused concern. Every time the doors to the emergency department swung open, he sat up a little straighter, hoping for news. Just as the evening light began to fade, a familiar face appeared, the doctor who had spoken with him earlier. "Mr. Durant?" she said, her voice low but warm. "Mrs. Thompson is awake now. She's still very weak, but if you'd like, I can let you visit her briefly." Relief flooded Ethan as he nodded, standing quickly. He followed the doctor down a series of quiet, sterile hallways until they reached a small room at the end of the hall. She gestured for him to enter, offering him an encouraging smile before stepping back to give them privacy. As Ethan stepped inside, his heart clenched at the sight before him. Mrs. Thompson lay in the hospital bed, her frail frame propped up by pillows, an IV line connected to her arm. She looked so small, so vulnerable, her face pale against the stark whiteness of the sheets. But as her eyes met him, a flicker of recognition passed over her face, and she managed a faint smile. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're here." He approached her bedside, taking her hand gently. "Of course I'm here, Mrs. Thompson. I was worried about you." She let out a soft, tired chuckle, a shadow of her usual laugh. "I must look a fright. Sorry you had to see me like this." Ethan shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "There's nothing to apologize for. I just want to make sure you're safe. You don't have to go through this alone, you know." Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, her hand squeezing his weakly. "I didn't want to be a bother, Ethan. I thought I could manage on my own." "You're not a bother," he replied firmly, "and no one should have to manage alone. You've always been there for me, always kind and thoughtful. It's my turn now, Mrs. Thompson. I'm here for you." Her eyes softened, gratitude shining through her weariness. "Thank you, Ethan. Truly." They sat together in silence for a moment, the weight of their unspoken connection filling the room. In that quiet space, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever Mrs. Thompson needed, he would do his best to ensure she never had to feel alone again. Ethan sat beside Mrs. Thompson's bed, watching as her eyes drifted closed briefly, then fluttered open, as if she were fighting to stay awake. Though her physical strength was clearly weakened, her spirit shone through, and Ethan could see glimpses of the vibrant, caring woman who had always greeted him with such kindness. After a few quiet minutes, Mrs. Thompson took a breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose I owe you an explanation, Ethan. You've been so kind, and yet I never told you." She trailed off, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan gently squeezed her hand. "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Thompson," he said softly. "But if you want to talk, I'm here to listen." She gave him a grateful smile, her frail fingers closing around his hand as she took comfort in his presence. "It started a few months back," she began, her gaze drifting toward the window. "I was diagnosed with cancer. They told me it was advanced, but I was determined to fight it. I thought I could handle it on my own. I didn't want to be a burden to anyone." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to her story. He could hear the pride and resolve in her voice, the fierce independence that had kept her going through so much. But he could also sense the loneliness that had accompanied her struggle. "The treatments were hard," she continued, her voice wavering. "Some days I could barely get out of bed, but I kept telling myself that it would get better, that I'd be back on my feet soon enough. I thought if I could just make it through each day, I'd get stronger." She paused, her hand trembling in his. "But then, one day, they told me the hospital was overcrowded and that my insurance wouldn't cover more inpatient care. They discharged me and said a home nurse would come by to check on me. But days passed, and no one ever came." Ethan's heart ached as he listened. Mrs. Thompson had always been such a beacon of strength and resilience, but hearing about her ordeal, he realized just how much she had endured alone. "You didn't want to ask for help, did you?" he asked gently, already knowing the answer. She shook her head slowly. "No, I'd always managed on my own. I didn't want to be anyone's burden. I thought I could do it, but eventually I couldn't even make it to the grocery store. I was living on crackers and soup packets. Each day, I felt myself slipping further away." Ethan's grip on her hand tightened, his heart heavy with guilt and compassion. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thompson. I should have noticed sooner." She gave him a weak smile, her eyes warm. "Ethan, you have nothing to be sorry for. You've been more than just a mailman to me, and today you did notice. You were there for me when I needed it most. That's more than I could have ever hoped for." They sat together in silence, her words settling over him like a comforting balm. But as the quiet stretched between them, Ethan felt a growing determination. Mrs. Thompson had been left to fend for herself by a system that should have helped her, and he knew he couldn't let her go back to that kind of life. After a moment, he looked at her, his expression resolute. "Mrs. Thompson, you're not going to face this alone anymore. I know there are people in the neighborhood who care about you. I'm sure if they knew what was happening, they'd want to help." A tear slipped down her cheek as she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "But Ethan, I can't impose on others. I don't want to be a charity case." "You're not," Ethan replied firmly. "People want to help each other, Mrs. Thompson. You've been a friend to me, to so many people. It's not charity, it's what neighbors do for one another. And if you'd let me, I'd like to make sure you're taken care of." For a long moment she looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and emotion. Finally she nodded, her hand squeezing his. I don't know what to say. Thank you, Ethan, truly." Ethan gave her a gentle smile. "You don't need to say anything. We'll get through this together." As they sat there, a plan began to form in Ethan's mind. He would talk to Mabel at the diner, reach out to Mr. Jenkins, and maybe even organize a small group of neighbors willing to pitch in. Mrs. Thompson wouldn't have to face her illness alone, and the weight of her burden could be shared by those who cared about her. With a deep sense of purpose, Ethan felt a renewed strength filling him. Mrs. Thompson had always shown kindness and warmth to everyone she met, and now it was his turn, and the community's, to give back. After a little while longer, a nurse came in to check on Mrs. Thompson, gently reminding Ethan that visiting hours would be ending soon. Reluctantly he stood, releasing Mrs. Thompson's hand, though he didn't want to leave her side. "Don't worry, Mrs. Thompson," he assured her as he adjusted her blankets. "I'll be back tomorrow, and I'll have some friends with me too. We're all going to make sure you're taken care of." A tired but hopeful smile spread across her face. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice full of warmth. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Ethan smiled back, a deep sense of gratitude filling him as he gave her hand a final squeeze. "Rest well, Mrs. Thompson. I'll see you soon." As he left the hospital, the evening air felt lighter, the weight of the day easing slightly. He'd come here as her mailman, her routine visitor, but he was leaving as something more, a friend, an ally, and someone determined to make a difference. The road ahead might be difficult, but with a strong heart and a caring community, Ethan knew they could face whatever challenges came their way. The next morning, Ethan awoke early, his mind already focused on the task at hand. He had spent the night considering how he could best support Mrs. Thompson and ensure she didn't have to struggle alone anymore. It was clear to him that it would take more than just his own efforts. Mrs. Thompson needed a network of people who could help her manage her day-to-day needs as she faced her illness. After finishing his morning deliveries, he decided to stop by Mabel's diner. Knowing Mabel was not only a trusted friend, but also someone with strong connections in the community. If anyone could help him organize support for Mrs. Thompson, it was her. As Ethan pushed open the door to the diner, the familiar jingle of the bell greeted him, and Mabel looked up from the counter, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Well, Ethan, you're here early today. Everything all right?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. He took a deep breath, giving her a nod as he sat at the counter. "Actually, Mabel, I came to talk to you about Mrs. Thompson. I found her in a terrible state yesterday, and she's in the hospital now. She's been struggling alone. I don't think anyone knew how bad things had gotten for her. Mabel's face fell, her hands stilling as she listened. Oh no, poor Jane. She's always been so independent. I had no idea she was going through all that. What can we do to help? Ethan felt a surge of relief at her immediate willingness to help. I was hoping we could get a few neighbors together to support her when she comes home. Simple things, like helping with groceries, making sure she's eating properly, maybe even keeping her company. I know it's a lot to ask, but she doesn't have anyone else. Mabel's face softened with sympathy, and she nodded resolutely. Ethan, you're doing a wonderful thing for her, and I'm more than willing to help. In fact, I'm sure others in the community would too. Jane's been such a friendly face in town all these years, it's only right we're there for her now. She glanced around the diner as if already sizing up potential volunteers. I'll spread the word to some of our regulars, and I know the church ladies will be more than happy to pitch in. Let's see if we can put together a schedule so there's always someone checking in on her. That way, she'll have company and support. Ethan felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Thank you, Mabel. I was worried people might think I was overstepping, but she's been so kind to me, I just couldn't leave her to face this on her own. Mabel patted his arm reassuringly. That's what community is for, Ethan. You've been a good friend to her, and now it's our turn. We'll make sure she gets through this. They spent the next half-hour brainstorming ideas and making a rough plan. Mabel suggested putting together a small fund to cover any extra costs that her insurance might not cover, and she even offered to organize a group from her church to bring meals every few days. As they talked, a few of the other regulars overheard, and soon, Ethan found himself surrounded by people offering to help in any way they could. Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Thompson's next-door neighbor, happened to walk into the diner as they discussed the plan. When he heard what had happened, he approached Ethan with a solemn expression. "Count me in, Ethan," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice resolute. "I've known Jane for years, and I had no idea she was going through this alone. I'd be more than happy to keep an eye on her place and maybe help out with her garden. She's always taken such pride in it. It would be a shame to see it go untended." Ethan felt a swell of pride and relief as he looked around the diner, seeing the genuine concern and compassion in his neighbors' faces. This was what he had hoped for, a network of support that would ensure Mrs. Thompson never had to feel abandoned or forgotten again. "Thank you, everyone," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "She's lucky to have neighbors like you, and so am I." With Mabel's help, they drew up a simple schedule, noting down who would check on Mrs. Thompson each day, who would handle grocery shopping, and who could drive her to medical appointments. Mabel offered to coordinate the meals, ensuring that Mrs. Thompson would have something nutritious and comforting to eat every day. As the plan came together, Ethan felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They were creating a safety net, one that would not only provide Mrs. Thompson with the physical support she needed, but also remind her that she was valued and cared for by her community. Before leaving the diner, Ethan took a moment to speak with Mabel privately. "Thank you, Mabel," he said, his voice soft. "I don't know if I could have done this without you." She smiled, her eyes kind and understanding. "It's not just me, Ethan. You're the one who saw what she needed, who stepped up when it mattered. Don't forget that. You've reminded all of us what it really means to be a neighbor." Ethan left the diner with a renewed sense of hope. He spent the rest of the day finishing his route, his heart lighter than it had been in days. As he delivered letters and packages, he couldn't help but feel that each connection he made was part of something much larger, a bond that linked him to every person in the community. That evening, Ethan returned to Mercy General, eager to see Mrs. Thompson and tell her about the support they had organized. He felt a twinge of nervousness, hoping she wouldn't feel overwhelmed by the help they had gathered. She was fiercely independent, after all, and he knew it might be difficult for her to accept the outpouring of support. When he arrived at her hospital room, he found her sitting up in bed, her face a little brighter than the day before. The sight brought a smile to his face, and he greeted her warmly as he pulled up a chair beside her. "Mrs. Thompson," he began gently, "I wanted to tell you about something we've been working on. A few of us in the neighborhood, Mabel, Mr. Jenkins, and some others, have put together a plan to help you when you come home. You won't have to worry about a thing. We'll be there to help with groceries, meals, and anything else you need." Her eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and emotion crossing her face. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. I don't know what to say. I never expected anyone to go to so much trouble for me." "It's no trouble at all," Ethan replied, smiling. "You've given so much kindness to all of us. This is just our way of giving back." Mrs. Thompson's eyes shimmered with tears, and she reached out to squeeze his hand. "Thank you," she murmured. "For the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm not alone. I don't know how to thank you enough." Ethan returned her grip, a deep sense of warmth and purpose filling his heart. "You're not alone, Mrs. Thompson. We're all here for you every step of the way." They sat together in a comfortable silence, the weight of their shared understanding filling the room. For Ethan, it was a moment that reaffirmed everything he believed in, that simple acts of compassion could change lives, and that a true community meant being there for one another. In the days that followed, word about Mrs. Thompson's situation spread through Copper Hill. The response from the community was immediate and heartwarming, as neighbors, friends, and even people who only knew her in passing reached out, eager to offer support. Ethan was amazed by the generosity he saw, from offers to cook meals to contributions to a fund that would help cover any of her medical expenses not covered by insurance. At Mabel's suggestion, they set up a small bulletin board in the diner where people could sign up for specific days to help Mrs. Thompson. Each slot filled up quickly, and soon they had a full schedule with volunteers ready to assist her with everything from yard work to providing her with rides to medical appointments. Ethan visited Mrs. Thompson regularly at the hospital, bringing updates from the neighborhood and reading her the encouraging notes people had left for her on the bulletin board. Each time he read one, she'd smile, her eyes misting with gratitude. She seemed stronger each day, her spirits lifted by the kindness surrounding her. One afternoon, Ethan sat by her hospital bed, reading a note left by one of her neighbors, Mrs. Fields. "Tell Jane she's like family to me," the note read. "I'll be there for anything she needs, no matter what." Mrs. Thompson's eyes shone with tears as she listened. "I never realized how much people cared," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I thought people had their own lives, their own troubles. I didn't want to add to that." Ethan took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "They care because you've touched their lives, Mrs. Thompson. You've given so much to everyone around you. Now it's your turn to let them give back." She smiled, brushing away a tear. "I suppose I never really understood what community meant until now." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Growing up, he'd always admired the idea of neighbors supporting each other, but this experience had shown him what it looked like in practice. It was more than just an ideal. It was a tangible force that could change lives, a network of people bound not by blood, but by compassion and kindness. When Mrs. Thompson was finally discharged from the hospital, Ethan was there to pick her up, along with Mabel and Mr. Jenkins. They had brought flowers and a few balloons, hoping to make her return home feel like a celebration. As they wheeled her to the car, Mrs. Thompson looked around, her face alight with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without all of you," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "We're just glad to have you back," Mabel replied warmly, giving her a hug. The drive to Elm Street was filled with laughter and conversation, a comforting reminder that Mrs. Thompson was truly cared for. When they arrived at her home, Ethan noticed that a few neighbors had gathered in her yard, waving and cheering her return. The sight brought a smile to his face, knowing that Mrs. Thompson was finally surrounded by the support she deserved. As Ethan and Mr. Jenkins helped her inside, Mrs. Thompson looked around, her eyes widening as she noticed the changes. The house had been cleaned, her pantry stocked with fresh food, and a cozy armchair with a warm quilt had been set up by the window, a welcoming sight arranged by her neighbors. Mrs. Thompson looked around in awe, her hand covering her mouth as she took it all in. Did you all do this?" Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "Everyone pitched in. They wanted to make sure you came home to a warm, welcoming space." Her eyes filled with tears and she took a shaky breath. "I've never felt so loved. Thank you, all of you. This is more than I could have ever hoped for." Over the next few weeks, the plan they had organized sprang into action. Neighbors stopped by each day to check on Mrs. Thompson, bringing meals, helping with household tasks, and keeping her company. Her days were filled with warm conversations, laughter, and a steady stream of support. The once empty house now echoed with the sounds of friends and neighbors who had come together to make a difference. Ethan continued his visits, often finding himself sitting with Mrs. Thompson by her front window, watching the activity in the neighborhood as they sipped tea and shared stories. She seemed stronger and more vibrant each day, the love and care from her community giving her a newfound strength. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with hues of pink and orange, Mrs. Thompson turned to Ethan, her eyes soft with gratitude. "You've given me more than just help, Ethan. You've given me hope. I thought my life was winding down, but now I feel like I've been given a new beginning." Ethan smiled, his heart filled with warmth. "You gave us all so much, Mrs. Thompson. This is just our way of saying thank you." As the months went on, Mrs. Thompson's health improved, and her resilience continued to inspire those around her. The community's support never wavered. If anything, it only grew stronger. Ethan saw firsthand how a single act of concern could ripple outward, touching lives and bringing people closer. One afternoon, while he was delivering mail, he ran into Mabel outside the diner. She grinned as she saw him, waving him over. "Ethan, you're a hero in this town, you know that?" she teased, patting him on the shoulder. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Not a hero, Mabel. I just did what anyone would do." She gave him a knowing smile. "Not everyone would have cared enough to go the extra mile, Ethan. You reminded us all what it really means to look out for each other." As he continued on his route that day, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had always taken pride in his job, but now it held a new, richer meaning. Each letter he delivered, each neighbor he greeted, felt like a connection he was nurturing, a small but meaningful part of the fabric of Copper Hill. And as for Mrs. Thompson, she had become a beloved figure in the neighborhood. Every time he stopped by her house, she greeted him with that familiar, warm smile, a look of gratitude in her eyes that needed no words. Ethan knew that they had both been forever changed by this experience, their bond a testament to the power of compassion and community. With each passing week, Mrs. Thompson continued to grow stronger. The support she received from her neighbors transformed not only her life, but also the community itself. She was no longer the quiet woman on Elm Street. She was now a cherished friend, a neighbor whose resilience and grace had inspired everyone around her. Ethan visited her almost every day, always bringing something small to brighten her spirits. A newspaper, a flower from a neighbor's garden, or sometimes just a smile and a story from his mail route. He was grateful for every chance to sit with her, to hear her laughter, and to share in her newfound sense of hope. One afternoon, as Ethan helped her tend to her small flower garden, Mrs. Thompson looked over at him, her eyes twinkling with humor. "You know, Ethan," she said, her voice warm, "I never thought I'd be out here again, planting flowers with someone else's help. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" Ethan chuckled, gently patting the soil around a blooming marigold. "It sure does, and I'm glad I get to be here for this surprise, Mrs. Thompson. You're a pretty tough lady." She laughed the sound of light and was filled with joy. "I think I was just too stubborn to give up. But I couldn't have done it without you and the others. You all gave me the strength I didn't even know I had." As they worked together in her garden, other neighbors stopped by to say hello, bringing over little gifts, freshly baked bread, a bouquet of wildflowers, and a handwritten card. Ethan noticed how Mrs. Thompson's face would light up with each visit, her spirits visibly lifted by the love and care her community continued to show her. In early autumn, as the air turned crisp and the trees in Copper Hill donned brilliant shades of red and orange, the community gathered to celebrate Mrs. Thompson's recovery. Mabel had suggested hosting a small neighborhood potluck in Mrs. Thompson's honor, and nearly everyone had volunteered to contribute. The event was held at the community center, where tables overflowed with homemade dishes, warm cider, and an assortment of fall-themed desserts. Ethan arrived early to help Mabel and a few others set up, arranging the tables with festive centerpieces and decorating the room with fall leaves and pumpkins. As the guests began to arrive, laughter and cheerful chatter filled the air, creating a warm and lively atmosphere. When Mrs. Thompson walked in, escorted by Ethan and Mabel, a round of applause broke out. She stood for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight of so many familiar faces gathered in her honor. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she took in the love and kindness surrounding her. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you all. For everything. I don't have the words to express how much this means to me." Ethan, standing by her side, gave her a reassuring smile. "You deserve it, Mrs. Thompson. We're just happy to have you with us." Throughout the evening, Mrs. Thompson moved from table to table, chatting with her neighbors, sharing stories, and savoring the joyful atmosphere. The event wasn't just a celebration of her recovery. It was a celebration of the strength and unity of their community. Everyone who had come together to help her felt a deep sense of pride and purpose, knowing they had made a real difference in her life. As the evening wound down, Mabel approached Ethan, a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. "We've all been through a lot these past few months," she said softly, "and it's thanks to you, Ethan. You were the one who saw the need, who acted when it mattered. We owe this to you." Ethan shook his head, feeling humbled. "No, Mabel, it was everyone who stepped up. I couldn't have done this alone." Mabel smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe so, but you reminded us all of what it means to care, to really look out for each other. You're a true neighbor, Ethan, and we're lucky to have you." As the guests began to gather their things and head home, Ethan looked around the room, taking in the warmth and unity that filled the space. Mrs. Thompson caught his eye from across the room and gave him a grateful smile, one that spoke of a friendship forged through hardship and strengthened by kindness. The days grew shorter, and soon the first frosts settled over Copper Hill, bringing with it the crispness of winter. As the holiday season approached, Ethan continued his usual route, delivering cards, packages, and holiday greetings to the people of Copper Hill. Each stop along his route now felt more meaningful, more connected. Every person he greeted, every home he visited, reminded him of the deeper ties that held their town together. One cold December morning, as he stopped by Mrs. Thompson's house to deliver a stack of holiday cards, he noticed her waiting by the door, bundled up in a cozy shawl. She waved him over, her face bright with excitement. "Come inside, Ethan. I have something for you," she called, motioning for him to follow her. Curious, Ethan stepped inside, feeling the warmth of her home. Mrs. Thompson led him to her small living room, where she handed him a beautifully wrapped box tied with a ribbon. "Open it," she urged, her eyes twinkling with anticipation. Ethan carefully unwrapped the box, lifting the lid to reveal a hand-knitted scarf in deep shades of blue and gray, the colors rich and warm. He looked at her, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I wanted to give you something special," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "Something to remind you of how much you mean to me and to everyone in this town. You were my light when I needed it most." Ethan wrapped the scarf around his neck, feeling its warmth. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. This means more to me than you know." They shared a quiet moment, the room filled with the comfort of friendship and gratitude. For Ethan, the scarf was more than just a gift. It was a reminder of the journey they had taken together. A journey that had changed them both in ways they could never have anticipated. As he stepped back out into the cold winter air, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past few months had taught him the true meaning of community, of friendship, and of the power of compassion. And as he continued his route that day, the scarf wrapped snugly around his neck, he knew that he was no longer just a mailman. He was a part of something greater, a web of kindness and care that connected each and every one of them.